What do you really know about the oldest gods in history? What if the Anunnaki aren't myths or even ancient astronauts, but echoes of something real? What if gods like Enki and Enlil shaped cultures for thousands of years through a realm beyond space and time? And what if the key to it all is hidden in the Sumerian language and decodes the secrets of the pyramids? Welcome to Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. Ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, comparative mythology enthusiasts, and last, but certainly not least, all of you that desperately cling to your confirmation bias. Whether your interest is Atlantis, or Zeus, cuneiform, or quantum physics, we tackle it all from our quantumly entangled castle, tucked away in the ancient flood-battered central Pangaean mountain range. We're the one-stop shop for myth, history, and comparative mythology. We're a podcast dedicated to exploring the ancient, mysterious, and unknown with logic and reason, and where we also theorize the geometric fourth dimension exists and is the spiritual. There will be some additional trigger warnings for this episode involving reproductive topics and recounting historic instances that may have involved non-consent. Listener discretion is advised. We're just going to be discussing this in a historical context. Aside from that, the only other trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation. So if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, turn off the podcast now. All right, and here we are on Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix, M-Quad. I have uncovered the secret of the pyramids. Maybe.
Have you?
Maybe, possibly. We'll find out. All right, so this is my first episode that I've been leading in a while. And we've had a lot of guests on, and you've been running a series for us. So I will probably have a little bit of rust to knock off, but it is what it is, you know?
Yeah.
Have some fun. But all right, we'll jump back into the old format here, and we're going to do episode overview. So episode overview, you are here, summary overview. That's what we're doing right now. So we're going to give you a little recap before we jump into everything as to what all we're going to discuss on this episode, and just so you can kind of have a little bit of direction. Then we're going to do a conclusion as well. We'll recap a lot of the things that we discuss in the episode to kind of help you digest it some. All right. After we finish this overview here, we're going to talk about Enki and the waters below, and we're going to talk about some mythology accounts involving Enki, who is one of the Mesopotamian deities. He also goes by Ea, that is his Akkadian name. Enki is the older Sumerian name. We're going to do some, I'll explain that in a minute. Then we're going to hit Enlil, and we're going to talk about storms in connection to Enlil. And then we're going to talk about On, who is king of the gods and an invisible architect, potentially. So for some of these, we're going to dive into like either myth retellings or brief myth recaps from the actual Mesopotamian tales that I've read and analyzed. We're going to pull out some key details, and then we're actually going to go through and analyze the original Sumerian names for each of these and what they likely mean, and then do a comparative analysis with what these names are, the behaviors we see in these mythology accounts as we go. And then after all that, we're going to talk about the sun and moon deities. So that's going to be Nana and Shamash. Well, that's the Akkadian name. Utu would be the Sumerian name. We're going to briefly mention them. I'm not going to go super in depth. But there's some thematic parallels across ancient texts that I think are relevant to explore there as we're talking about everything in the broader conversation that we're going to be having. And then after that, we're going to hit our last point, which is why all the high places? And we're going to tie our comparative mythology analysis together in a really neat and beautiful bow for the listeners. And we're going to make you think about ancient myths in a way that you've probably never thought about them before. And it might change how you read and think about ancient myths here on out. So if that idea is uncomfortable to you, you'll definitely want to turn off the podcast right now. And then finally, of course, like I said, we're going to have a conclusion, recap. I'm going to hit some quick housekeeping items for the podcast and then closeouts. Any thoughts?
No. None whatsoever.
All right. One quick correction from the last episode. I called you queen in Akkadian, and to kind of play off the joke we had been going on, and I said Sharatum, and it's actually Sharatum. The emphasis is not on the A there, and that might not sound like a big deal to listeners, but as you and I both know, going through Akkadian, that can be the difference between having a husband or between dying, quite literally. So
yes,
mutum is husband, and mutum is death for our curious listeners. So emphasis matters in Akkadian. So yeah, I just wanted to come back and clarify that real quick, just to show that, not perfect here, but, still going through, still learning the languages.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to roll into part 1 here. So Enki, Lord of the Abzu and creator of order. So we'll start this one off with a brief overview of a mythology account. It's called Enki and the World Order, at least in Jeremy Black's version of Myths of Mesopotamia. Literature of Ancient Sumer, Jeremy Black's Literature of Ancient Sumer. You can also get this from numerous other free resources. You don't have to read a book for that. So basically, this tale is largely a praise song or a poem almost even to Enki, just talking about how awesome he is. He's responsible for bringing plenty to the region of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent there, and he's responsible for assigning roles to the gods within the kingdom and creation to help kind of maintain that order. The text repeatedly emphasized how Enlil is over Enki, and Enki is serving him by bringing this fertility and prosperity to the land and helping to fill the temple of Enlil with, all sorts of goods and plenty and food. And then this one gets a little interesting here, where Enki creates the Tigris from his bodily fluids involving a sexual act. I don't like to get explicit on the show, but I'm not going to censor these myths either, so I'll let the audience kind of infer your conclusions there. A sexual act from bodily fluids. But it symbolizes his creative power through water because he's a deity of water. And it actually almost communicates this idea as well that he's putting a part of himself into what he's creating and what he's maintaining in terms of order of creation. Yeah, but then, this just kind of adds into that, sending abundance and prosperity through irrigation specifically, which pleases Enlil because everything's successful, there's plenty of food, and everybody's happy. So Enki creates the Tigris from his bodily fluids, and it symbolizes, potentially at least, life flowing from the deep. And what I think is interesting in this account here, and this kind of plays into my broader thought as to why I look at the Bible the way I do in comparison to these other myths, is that it talks about the creation of the Tigris here, but it doesn't mention the Gihon or Pishon rivers that we get mentioned in Genesis 2. And that's what kind of leads me to believe when we're looking at this comparative myth analysis of these accounts, that Genesis is a more holistic, regional account of what's happening. And these other tales that we're seeing from ancient Sumer and Mesopotamian region, they're a bit more focused to their specific locale. And this is just one of many factors that adds into all of that. But yeah, this emphasizes some of Enki's domains here, that he is the god of water, wisdom. And wisdom is kind of weird, my understanding of it, from like the way the ancients viewed it, is it wasn't just wisdom, it was also like sorcery in a sense, like magic. Mm-hmm. So he also has like the ability to do like crafts, trickery. Trickery is something that's used to describe him, but I from all the tales that I've read, and I've read like, several books on Mesopotamian literature, I just don't see a trickster aspect to it. We'll talk about that more in a little bit though, because there's some interesting beliefs on the tale of Adapa. We've talked about it before on the show, but I'm going to hit that again just in context of Enki and some more fringe ideas on Enki in a comparative myth analysis standpoint. Another fun one, we talked about this one on the last episode, but Uznum means wisdom and also ear in Akkadian, which I think...
Not earbuds.
Yeah, not earbuds, like you said. I don't know. Hey, maybe the Akkadians in 2000 BC did indeed have earbuds, and they were jamming out to some ancient chants in Sumerian or something. I don't know.
Who knows?
Learning Sumerian on the iTablet. There you go. But so, we could look at this idea of how Uznum, it means wisdom or ear in Akkadian. And at least from my loose, I've just begun learning Akkadian within the last month and a half. So this is beginner level. But I would look at this and I would say that we might even be able to understand Enki or Ea abstractly as the God who listens, which kind of plays into this aspect of a dual meaning of Enki's role in the Enuma Elish potentially, which I reviewed the account. It seems like the gods just kind of collectively hear of Abzu's intent in the Enuma Elish to wipe out all the younger gods. And it doesn't mention Ea or Enki specifically as being the one that learns of it, but I can't help but wonder if it just kind of collectively says all of them, and he's just kind of inferred to be the one because of a concept like this. But yeah, and then he destroys the deity Abzu in the Enuma Elish, and ironically, he then becomes the ruler of the unpersonified Abzu. So Abzu is used to then refer to subterranean waters. It parallels the Hebrews Tehom that we see used in Genesis 1:2, and then again in Genesis 7:11, where Genesis 7:11 says the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That those fountains of the great deep is the same concept of what the Mesopotamians would have understood the Abzu as having been. It just would have been these subterranean fresh waters exploding. Well, not exploding necessarily, because the Abzu here is just a general concept for the subterranean waters. But Genesis 7:11 then progresses that to say these subterranean fresh waters exploding out. The underworld is seen as deeper than this. So like the Hades of the Mesopotamian world, like the whatever you want to call it, the world, the realm of the dead, basically.
So underworld.
Yeah, is seen as deeper than the Abzu. The Abzu is kind of like a buffer or above this. All right, so there's a little bit about Enki, who he is, what his domains are, what he rules. Let's talk about name etymology here. So breaking down the Sumerian, because I like to go back to the older source, and the older source here is Sumerian, debatably, but at least in Sumerian, the etymology of Enki's name breaks down to the signs En, which mean Lord, and Ki, which means earth. So this can be, if we want to break it down, potentially be Lord of the earth. There is some theorization from my research and study of Sumerian that indicates that the name possibly had older origin and that this was then re-synergized into Sumerian. So this could be another instance like we've talked about with like Inanna and Namu and some other deities of a pre-Sumerian deity that then just gets co-opted and adopted into the language itself. And so this might not be the best reflection of how the Sumerians viewed Enki, but it could be. There's some debate on that. His cult center, his worship following, was based in Eridu, which housed the Abzu, which is the house of the Abzu. I don't know if this was an actual temple, and this is something I should have looked into a little bit more. So now that we're doing the episode, I'm remembering from my Sumerian textbook, there was some nuance in the way that the Abzu was described.
Do you want me to look something up?
No, because it was in my Sumerian textbook specifically,
okay.
and you won't be able to find that online. But anyway, so there might be some nuance there as to whether this was a temple, a well, or some kind of conglomeration of both. But I'd have to fact check that to be certain.
Maybe you can put that in the notes.
Yeah, you can put that in the notes for me. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. And connection points. We already kind of talked about the springs bursting forth and then the Genesis flood waters. That was really my key connection for comparative myth, just kind of breaking down Enki here. The other ones are, I think, going to get a little more interesting. Final point on Enki before we take a break and then shift gears to talking about Enlil is people have suggested the idea that Enki is Lucifer. And I think they get this idea largely from the Adapa tale, where Enki gives Adapa guidance on what to do when he's taken to heaven because he makes the gods angry. I'm going to give like a TLDR, too long, don't read version of Adapa here. So if you want to hear a very like specific account, we have a retelling of it from a previous episode, some episodes back, and you can go read it yourself online. I'm sure you can like on the ETCSL or something like that. But basically, Adapa makes the gods angry, so he gets summoned to the heavens, and Enki gives him advice before he goes, and Enki's like, hey, this is what's going to happen. Here's what you should do. And Enki is right about everything until the very end, and Enlil is impressed with Adapa, and he offers him the food of life, but Enki had told him that they would call it the food of life, but it's actually the food of death. And so he instructs Adapa to not partake in it, because it's poison. That's what Enki says. But it's actually the real food of like immortality. And so Adapa turns down immortality. And so you kind of have this vague idea of a trickster aspect where Adapa is tricked out of getting immortality because of Enki's bad advice. But the thing is the text, at least as far as we have it, far as I've seen from Stephanie Dawley's translation and any other versions I was able to come across online, there isn't a specification that Enki deceives Adapa. It could have just been an unintentional mistake or an oversight, or it could be that even Enki thought that Enlil was going to order that Adapa be put to death with this food and to kill him, but then he changes his mind when he sees how clever Adapa is after following Enki's advice. So there's a lot of nuance in how we break this tale down, and I think it's, as I've seen scholars even try to overgeneralize this and say that this is a similar theme to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and that's a stretch. It doesn't quite give us that in the text, and to make that leap, you're making an assumption, which it's fine if you want to make, but then you need to clarify that it's an assumption and not just say that that's the way it is. But I don't know. I said a lot. What do you think? Any final thoughts, interjections? Nope, just along for the ride. All right. Well,
listen, I'm tired from leading a couple of podcast episodes. I don't know how you do so many.
Yeah, I know. All right. Well, we will be back in just a moment. Stay tuned. And we have returned from the Abzu, the depths of the world, to talk about Enlil now in this episode where we are going to take you on a mythic journey. All right, so this is part 2. Enlil, the sex-crazed storm god of the mountain, because that's really just the best way to put it.
All right.
Again, like I don't like to overfixate on details like this. The listeners, we've done like 60 podcasts. This is episode 61. We've done 60 podcast episodes. I don't just bring this stuff up to bring this stuff up because I don't like to talk about raunchy stuff. But when it is what the myths say, or is at least implied by the myths, I want to be true to the accounts and at least reference it so that the listeners get a holistic view. And that's why we put the disclaimers at the beginning, where if these topics are disturbing to you and are going to trigger you, you have that warning kind of going into it.
They're definitely explicit. So
yes. So yeah, we're just going to jump right into this one here. So this is the key sensitive part. So the first retelling is going to be Enlil and Ninlil's relationship. It's I'm going to very much abbreviate it because there are a number of Mesopotamian tales that just hyperfixate on sex. And I'm going to abbreviate this one. But basically, there's repeated seduction that happens in this one, possibly rape in the first encounter. And then the rest seem consensual, almost desperate even, which is a very interesting nuance. Maybe you can shed some light on the psychology of that. I don't know if I'm asking you this on the fly, so don't worry about having anything absolute. Just any thoughts as they come.
There's a lot of context that I need for that.
Well, I'm going to give you a recap of the story.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically the story itself is centralized around, like the whole point of the story is that Enlil is sleeping with Ninlil, and that this produces several of the other deities like the moon god, Nana. So it starts off with Ninlil is going down to bathe in the river, I believe it's the Tigris, and her mother warns her not to because it's like a divine river, more or less, and that she's going to attract the attention of the gods. And she disregards the advice and she goes down, but sure enough, Enlil sees her and he wants to sleep with her. And she declines, and there's some very rich language into her declining. And he ultimately, like, it doesn't flat out say that he rapes her, but she declines and then sex happens. And so it's like you can't really infer anything else off of that.
Yeah.
So one interesting aside here, and I'm just kind of going with the flow of the story and the events that happen. So this rape instance happens, and then there's a mention of Enlil being declared the builder of the Ekur in the flow of events, in the descriptions of him, which that'll be, that's a surprise tool that'll help us later, kind of thing. So put that one in your back pocket for now. And then what I think is interesting is that after this encounter happens, it's the text, specifically the Literature of Ancient Sumer, Jeremy Black's version, says the 50 great gods and the 7 gods that decree destinies declare Enlil ritually impure and kick him out of the city. And this is kind of a loose paraphrase here. But I think this is kind of weird because Enlil is typically depicted as the chief Mesopotamian deity. And here we very clearly see instances where there is, in Mesopotamian thought and belief, other gods higher than Enlil and that have more power over him. And it's interesting that it's an act of sex that gets, specifically rape, but sex that gets Enlil declared ritually impure. I think that has some interesting connotations to it, especially looking to things like the tale of the Watchers in Enoch. But anyway, so after this happens, Enlil follows him out and pursues him, and they engage in other multiple encounters. And it gets kind of weird because Enlil disguises himself as different people, and Enlil wants to sleep with Enlil as he's disguised as these other people. So it's not clear if she actually knows that it's him, and they're just kind of playing a weird game of cat and mouse, like first documented case of role playing going on here, or if there's if she's just suffering a lot of trauma because of the rape and looking to regain control, and maybe that's a psychological perspective, or if there's some other nuance going on here where sleeping with a divine entity affects you and how you perceive things and kind of almost gets you addicted. So I don't know what's going on here exactly, but this is what the text says. And then, as I said, their union produces several underworld deities, including the moon god Swen. It seems to mirror that sons of God coming down and taking any whom they choose that we see in Genesis 6. And then again, that book of Enoch parallel. Any thoughts you want to add? It's very, very loaded topic, I know.
Yeah. So first, would you say that Enlil was punished, not for the rape, but for violating a social or divine order?
Yes, absolutely. Which I think, which is weird because Enlil is typically depicted as a very high up, if not the highest deity, and he has a higher power that he's answering to.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
But you wanted me to talk about the psychology from Enlil's?
Yeah, you kind of have a loose feel of the story here where she declines and gives an excuse about not wanting to sleep with Enlil. He does anyway. He gets punished. She goes out and pursues him, and she sleeps with Enlil. Whether or not she knew it was Enlil all those other times, a lot to, there's some room for interpretation there.
From what I've learned so far, a non-consensual sexual encounter, followed by, I guess, I don't want to say submission, but it kind of sounds like that from her perspective and the story.
Right. Well, I mean, you have a deity figure like Enlil.
Compliance.
Well,
almost.
Yeah, it's like you have a deity figure like Enlil, who's a literal demigod or lowercase g god who has all this power. If he wants to rape you, what are you going to do? So there's really nothing else to do but to just submit almost.
Right. That is a good point, but there's also, I think they call it the fawn response or something like that, where it's submissive coping.
Yeah, that actually sounds you're right, because I've heard of that.
And then there's There's like an internalized belief too that they believe that they deserve being treated like that due to like the power dynamic. So maybe because Enlil has a higher power dynamic over Ninlil,
Ninlil, yeah.
That maybe she feels that that's like, I don't want to say a calling. I'm trying to be very sensitive about the topic, but maybe she would feel that way. Like, okay, because he's like a demigod or a lowercase, god, that, maybe this is my purpose in life.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting too, because Ninlil, and I'm going off the hip here from memory on Sumerian, so this may be wrong. I don't have this one in my notes, but Ninlil breaks down to Nin, which I believe is lady, and then Lil, which is of the wind or storms, which we'll talk about Enlil's name breakdown in a minute here and what the connotations of that. But the name here kind of almost embodies a purpose of connection to Enlil. So I think you might actually be spot on in that her name might have been given because of that flipping of purpose, and her name might have been something else before.
Well, because we also have name changes in the Bible as well.
Yeah, with Abraham.
Because of purpose.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe that's a connection as well.
Absolutely. The ancient Near East names were not just names like in the legal sense we see them today. Names were a description of who you were, who you are, and like your overall purpose in life.
Yeah.
And that's why God changes Abram's name to Abraham in the biblical account, because it's father of many. And that's the purpose he's given with that name. Any final thoughts on that?
I'm guessing the myth only really explores Enlil's side of things, not Ninlil's.
Yeah, it's
okay. So there's like a lot of internal context for Ninlil's perspective that we don't have.
Yes.
So to emphasize, these are assumptions. These are just, what's the word?
Logical speculation,
yes,
which is what we always do on this show. We're not meaning to be insensitive to anyone that's experienced this or anything like this. We're just trying to read this myth as honest as we can and figure out what's going on. And again, I'm not trying to make light of anyone's past with anything remotely related to this non-consensual stuff, rape, unacceptable, absolutely. And we're just trying to look at this here and figure out, is that what's going on here? What are the psychological connotations to that? Because we see the psychological effects of things in other mythology accounts with the cursing of a god or a Akkad. You see, I believe it's Naram Sin, is the last king of the Akkadian Empire. You watch him go through these cycles of grief where he's depressed because he realizes his kingdom is going to fall with him and that he's not going to have a place in the world. And it goes from this depression to anger, and he actually lashes out at the gods and destroys Enlil's one of Enlil's key temples. And then all the gods are like, yeah, all right, we're done with you, and that sealed your fate. So you do see these human reactions and aspects in these myths here. And again, that's why I think that there's more truth to these tales than people realize. I think there's, John Hayes in the Sumerian manual I'm working through, he talks about how the Sumerians didn't have a traditional Greek method or Roman method for keeping history, but that they had these myths, these tales. And so we don't know how much of this is true. Then this is me adding onto it at this point. We don't know how much of this is true. It could literally be every word of the Gilgamesh tale is true, exactly as it is. Or it could be that the majority of it is metaphor and that there's all sorts of hidden meaning encoded in it. Right. We just don't know.
Just one last point. I do think that it was a really good thing to point out how close their names are. I think that there's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. That they're somehow connected, but I think they made the names that closely related to each other because of the sexual aspect to it, to somehow symbolize that they're connected, not through just physical, but with the names as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about Ninlil's name again a little bit more and contrast it to Enlil specifically in just a minute or two here. I'm going to do one more myth retelling, and then we'll explore that. Second myth retelling is the Song of the Hoe. So a little bit of background here. something called debate poems were very common in Mesopotamia. It was a form of entertainment almost, where they would take two things like fish and grain that were both useful to life, and they would assign like two people to debate this, potentially, at least in the courts, for entertainment. And they would go back and forth and say, oh, I'm more useful because I provide wool and I provide milk. Fish, or like from a sheep's perspective, or like grain might say like, hey, I'm useful because they use me for bread, and then I get used as malt in the beer that gives the people nutrients that they need. And so they would go back and forth a lot. And so you have a lot of debate poems that we have remnants of in Mesopotamian literature. And so the Song of the Hoe is not exactly a debate poem, but it is vaguely similar in a sense where it's praising the use of the hoe for digging and for cultivating and forming.
Thank you for saying that.
Yes.
Because I thought you were meaning like a person.
No. Garden tool.
Garden tool.
Yeah, I need to clarify that, especially segueing from our last topic there. No, we're not talking. No, anyway, I'm not going to go there. We're just going to keep going.
We're not going to call a person that, just so you know.
No, I'm talking about the garden tool. It was a little bit different for the Mesopotamians.
Yes.
It wasn't exactly the way we have our modern garden hoe tools. I'm gonna have to say garden in front of it every single time now.
Yeah, or just tool or something.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
All right. So this is an exaltation to the tool, though, about how useful that a hoe is for the people and for Enlil specifically. Because when you have a creative act, what does the person doing the creating use? A hoe, in this case. It uses a tool, a gardening tool. And that's what... But yeah, so it's a creation account where Enlil is creating with this tool, and the tale says that daylight is created when Enlil separates heaven and earth at Enki. And I'm going to throw these terms around. I'm not going to define them yet. We're going to circle back to them, so don't worry if I'm throwing around some Sumerian words and you're a little bit confused as to what they specifically mean. We're going to circle back and break down etymology in a couple more segments because it's more relevant then. But it actually then says that the gods want the Sumerians, and they want them from Enlil. They want like the charge of them, the command of them, which I think is interesting. And again, that mirrors what we see with the Deuteronomy 32 aspect, where the sons of God are being assigned to rule over humanity. And that's at least one reading of the Deuteronomy 32 account. And we can kind of see that mirrored here, where Enlil has been given the Sumerians, and the other gods are like, no, I want the Sumerians. Like, why didn't I get them? I want them. Give them to me. And we kind of see that dynamic going on a little bit here in this tale. And then again, it says specifically that the Ekur is founded by Enlil's hoe, which you'll recognize we just mentioned the Ekur in the Enlil and Enlil account as well. And I'm saying all of this to build up to something here. So again, surprise tool, it'll help us later. Put it in your back pocket.
I could have said a really good joke, but I'm not gonna.
Oh boy. All right. And then finally, the last thing here is with after the Ekur is founded by the tool, it says that other temples and altars are created for the gods. And so we have this kind of prioritization of Enlil once again, where he's the chief Mesopotamian deity, and then other gods get their things. We've already talked a little bit about how I think it's interesting that Enlil is described as ritually impure, but central to divine order in the Mesopotamian pantheon, which indicates that there's a higher power or some higher thing above Enlil. His domains are storms, air, wind. The name breakdown we'll talk about Enlil here too, since we were contrasting her a little bit, is En for Lord once again, and Lil, which is wind or spirit. So a more literal way to understand Enlil's name is Lord of the Air. And you'll recognize Lil, I think, the Lil word at least, the root, because that's where Lilith comes from.
That's where my mind immediately went to was Lilith, and then what's the male? Lilu?
Lilu, and then Lilitu, which, again, this makes sense with Akkadian, the T being factored in. Yeah. So we've been both learning Akkadian. So, yeah.
I've been attempting to.
You're doing good. You've reviewed the words a lot less, yet you remember them a lot more, which
Other than earbuds.
Yeah, not that one.
I will never live that down.
Yeah. But yeah, so Lilu, Lilitu, it's the root for that. Jeremy Black actually notes, though, that there's no direct connection to argue that Enlil then evolved into Lilith or vice versa, but the roots themselves are undeniable, that they're used in both instances. And then again, contrasting this to Ninlil, which means Lady of the Wind. You know, if Enlil's the Lord of the Wind, this is the Lady of the Wind. She's kind of exalted because of her quote-unquote purpose, as you described, where she might have viewed it that way because of the trauma, to see herself as, you know, the Lady of the Wind, or exalted to that by the people around her even.
Right.
But what I always think was interesting is when I was studying this one in my Sumerian textbook, what immediately came to mind for me was the Bible verse in Ephesians 2 that talks about the prince of the power of the air. And I'm like, prince of the power of the air, lord of the air. And I dug into it a little bit more. And in Enlil and the Ekur, which is another tale from Mesopotamian literature, it actually uses Nun and UN to describe Enlil as one of his titles, which means prince. It calls him a prince of heaven, which I think is interesting that we have these terms being kind of conflated here. And so I think this may be, again, a little bit of a theorization here, but I think this may be referring to the same entity. The entity we see referred to in Ephesians 2 might actually be a reference or nod to the existence of Enlil, which I think is really cool. Thoughts? You got the look of the collie. We can just keep going. We'll just keep going. I'll let you think on that one for a minute.
Yeah, I'm going to have to.
You didn't get your second coffee. I get it.
I didn't.
No worries. All right, so shifting gears a little bit here, the Hebrew word for wind can also be spirit, ruach. We see this occur all throughout the Bible. And so understanding that Lil also has those same connotations of being understood as wind and being the root for, you know, male or female night demons, spirits, Enlil could also poetically be understood as Lord of the Spirits, which again ties into that Prince of the Power of the Air idea. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things too, because I've been going through the Nuala Pin, which is the Babylonian star chart, which is talking about, there's one section that's talking about like the direction the wind blows on a day that a king has his coronation will affect the kind of king that he is. Which again, you got to wonder with the way that they viewed wind, are they seeing it as wind or are they seeing it as some kind of a spirit, like the North Spirit, South Spirit, East Spirit, West Spirit? But Enlil himself. So let's talk about his cult center. The temple is, his main temple is in Nippur. That's where the Ekur is. And Ekur is E, which is house, and Kur, which is mountain in Sumerian. And so the Ekur is literally mountain house, house on the mountain, house of the mountain. All valid ways to understand this here, at least from my understanding of Sumerian. And, you know, looking at all of this here, Enlil being the god of storms, wind, spirits, and sex crazed, I think comparisons to Zeus and Baal are very worth having. Zeus is known repeatedly in myth for having a lot of sexual encounters and raping in instances, and Baal a bit sex crazed as well, especially in the worship of Baal. So we see a lot of comparisons for this kind of archetype across myth. And again, surprise tool that'll help us later.
I so want to say my joke right now.
Is it appropriate?
You can beep it out if it isn't.
All right, go ahead.
Surprise later.
Okay. I'm going to beep that out.
It was good, though.
I'm going to make a note of the timestamp of that and beep it out. Listeners will forever wonder.
It was good, and you know it.
Oh, boy.
All right, I'll behave.
I can't take you anywhere. All right.
I'll behave.
Okay. I do also think this is something else I was thinking of today on my run, actually. I think it's weird that there's a lot of missing 411 person cases that Dave Paulides ties to storms showing up and interfering with the search parties, too.
Yes. So we read a lot of cases together.
Yeah.
And they all started to sound the same at one point, but the storms or just weather in general
were a big factor.
There was a lot. There was a lot of cases that were like connected to rocks and stuff too, like big structures and all that. But yeah, sorry.
Storms. No, you're good.
I don't want to take away from.
No, you're good.
Yeah.
Yep, no worries. I just want to stay on track, but it was an interesting aside I wanted to mention real quick, since that was a motif Dave Paulides had mentioned, and that was something interesting that kind of jumped out to me, where a lot of this stuff is connected in myth. And so is this indicating that there's a higher power involved in both? Is this just like a common theme, that people saw people go missing in storms and they attributed it to a higher power? It's stuff that we've got to think about and ask.
If you haven't read some of the 411 cases, some of them are really freaky, but they're very interesting.
They are. Yeah, I got the 411 East book. It's definitely an interesting read. We haven't even finished it yet.
No, we haven't.
But yeah, no. So final questions here, and then we'll take another break that I want to ask the audience here to get your gears thinking, because this isn't just a let me talk to you podcast. This is I want to spur some thoughts and get interactions from the listeners. Is Enlil a watcher, perhaps, that we see from the Book of Enoch? Is he even maybe a faithful angel that is then fallen? Or could it be a distorted memory of Lucifer or some other archetype of angel? Only other thing I'll throw in here is, if you're enjoying everything so far, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, follow, 5-star review, or whatever support you're able on the specific platform you're listening on. But
we want to make friends.
You make us sound so desperate.
We're not desperate, but
No.
we like having friends.
As
would anyone.
I like having friends that are seekers of truth.
We like friends that are like Steven.
Yes, be a Steven.
And Cordell.
Yes, seek out truth, not confirmation bias. Stay tuned. Next up, we will be exploring On in the Mesopotamian pantheon. And this, I think, is where things start to get really interesting. And we're returning to you from the mythic plane here on Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix to talk about the Mesopotamian pantheon and explore who they are, what do they want, and what can we glean about them from the various ancient texts that we have, which apparently the majority of Sumerian cuneiform texts are actually untranslated, which that kind of blew my mind a little bit, that we have I think they're largely like receipt documentary type like logs, but there's a lot of Sumerian documents that we just don't currently have translated. So I thought that one was interesting. But all right, so let's talk about On. He's the Latin Deus Otiosus and King of the Shadows. Basically, because I saw you kind of flinch at that one, it's basically ruling from behind the scenes.
Felt like I had a seizure listening to that.
Yes. Yeah. Same. I saw that word, a description of him, and I'm like, what? What is this? Anyway.
What's
Sumerian?
this?
No
What's
problem.
This?
Latin? Quack. Anyway. So his role in the Mesopotamian pantheon, he's more of an issuer of decrees. He doesn't really do much acting himself when we see him in tales. He's very elusive. He's actually rarely, if ever, depicted in Mesopotamian art. And there's one point, Jeremy Black, I believe, makes a note that he's connected to being a ruler of the third heaven, depending on the views that you have on like a heaven hierarchy. So a good example of how On behaves is in the Anzu tale, Stephanie Dawley's translation. On specifically orders other gods to go out and act, and then eventually Ninurta steps forward and goes out and defeats Anzu. So title. This one will be a little bit quicker, I think. So his title, at least in one of the Mesopotamian, or the Sumerian tablets I saw, On Lugal Dingur Re'en. So basically, king of the gods is what that means.
Okay.
I think it's interesting that there's some nuance in Sumerian writing that's worth exploring here briefly. The Mesopotamians used what's called the Dinger symbol, for marking deities. So it's like a star. It's like the little asterisk thing, like on your keyboard.
Okay.
It's like that little like asterisk you do when you want to make like a typo correction or whatever when you're texting someone. It's like that, but like full font size, not just a little tiny thing at the top. But they would do that to mark a deity. So like if they were writing the sign for Inanna, which is just one sign, they would do a dinger sign and then Inanna, like the sign for Inanna, and that marks that it's a deity. It even appears in like the names of humans that are named for God. So like Namu is and then he's named for the deity Namu, and so you see a dinger in the preface to Namu. But it gets weird because dingers can sometimes be phonetic for the sound on, and it can actually also be the sign for the deity on himself. So it gets very confusing, and Sumerian is like this a lot, where there's multi-use signs that have actually tripped me up a couple times in like my trying to decipher the tablets in John Hay's manual.
Sounds like they hated themselves.
Well, writing wasn't like everybody could do it either. That was something that you had a lot of training to do. So,
well,
but I mean,
yeah.
it's like there. You know, like over there, they're going to the store.
Yeah.
You know, all the different uses there.
Here. C.
Yeah, C and C and C. Letter C.
Yeah.
So it's like you've got all these different things. We have similar things to this in English, but it's interesting that the sign for on is also a sign for a divine determinative, which it kind of indicates, again, it kind of reinforces that idea that on is supreme over all of these deities. So, but yes. So you have this divine hierarchy with an inactive supreme deity. And this vaguely, I was thinking about this and looking at like the name and everything and how On is described. And I'm like, this echoes what we see in the Bible. We see it in 1 Kings 22, where Yahweh is debating about how to, the fate of Ahab and how Ahab is going to be deceived into going into this battle. And these spirits are coming forward proposing ideas to Yahweh. And that's kind of what we see going on in a sense with On at certain points. And then we also have like Job 1 and 2, where there's a heavenly council framework where the accuser is going up, you know, before God and prompting God to test Job. So biblical God and On do seem to share, at least in part, the same archetypal structure. And so I don't want to commit heresies here, but it does lend an idea to were these potentially the same deity, or at least maybe On was based off of this idea of Yahweh and a supreme deity that got kind of blurred out when the Watchers descended, and you had these angels running around that then took the place of this behind the scenes deity. Which then makes sense as to why we see Enlil very quickly become the chief Mesopotamian deity and not On, because On is so far behind the scenes. I don't know, I just keep saying On, and I keep thinking of the live-action Avatar movie, Ong, instead of Aang. Anyway.
Anytime you say On, I think of our On, like O-N, On, and I'm like, what's he on?
Sometimes he's called Anu as well.
That's the Akkadian.
I think that's the Akkadian. Yeah, I might be mistaken on that, but that's my hip reflex right there.
I think you're right.
Okay, but yeah, basically we see Enlil take over from On, kind of being in charge, and you got to ask: does this mirror Lucifer's rise, or at least the rise of the Watchers in some capacity? And again, it's kind of lending to this idea, where if a divine hierarchy existed pre-Babel, do you think the Mesopotamian myths are even memories, possibly warped, possibly not, of these real spiritual entities actually doing stuff and coming down? So, I don't know. It's food for thought. Questions that we've got to ask. Anything that you wanted to add to that, or should I shift over to the next topic?
I think you're good to shift.
All right. So we're going to talk about sun and moon deities briefly, and then we're going to get to the real juicy stuff and my theory on the pyramids here at the end. So the sun and moon deities, Shamash and... excuse me. I should have put this one better in my notes. So the sun and moon deities is Suen, or Father Nana, is the moon deity in Sumerian, and Utu is the sun deity. And then we see him also called Shamash in the Epic of Gilgamesh, for those that are familiar with that tale. And that's the Akkadian name. And the Akkadian name for Father Nana Suen is Sin. Clear as mud, right? All right.
Just about.
So Utu Shamash, who is the sun god, Utu Sumerian, Shamash Akkadian, is the sun god. He's associated with divine justice. And we see this a lot. We see this with Gilgamesh and Enki going out on their journey. We see this in Etana with the tale of the serpent and the eagle and how the serpent calls out to Shamash. And that's why the serpent and the eagle swear an oath invoking Shamash so that justice will be done to anyone that any of the parties that breaks the oath. But what I think was interesting, so I was reading through First Enoch, prepping for an upcoming episode on the Book of Enoch, and there was a watcher that was named Shamael, and he's teaching the signs of the sun. And I'm like, well, wait a second here. This is familiar. I'm like, this might be related to the Hebrew for sun, which is Shamash. So it's just the vowel difference there from the Akkadian Shamash, which these are both Semitic languages, so that similarity makes sense. But we see a watcher bearing a potential root for sun in Hebrew paired with El, which is referring to a deity status. I'm looking at this and I'm like, could it be that Shamash was actually just a fallen watcher as well? And I was trying to dig into this a little bit more. It seems like I don't think we have any actual Hebrew versions of this specific section of the Book of Enoch. I got an interlinear analysis of it, but it was a Greek version, and it omits or alters, like, it kind of blurs it a little bit. It has a little bit of different rendition of this than the other translation I was reading of Enoch, and I'm not quite sure as to why, but that was an interesting detail that stood out to me reading like these texts. And then we also have another deity named Sariel teaching moon signs. And so again, the moon deity is Swen, Nana, Sin, and Sar in Sumerian means to write. Now, the Mesopotamians had a large link to lunar calendars. They relied on the moon a lot more than the sun to keep track of progression of time. And I got to wonder if there's any kind of connection with Sar and Sariel. It's very speculative, I know, a little bit of a stretch, but you got to wonder if there's any connection there between the name and the actual purpose and function of the deity. But yeah, so ultimately I kind of bring all of this up to say that I think that watchers could be divine rulers that are just remembered in our myths. You have any other thoughts or interjections? All right.
I don't believe so.
All right. Final segment coming up here. We are going to talk about cosmic portals. We'll be right back. Traveling back through the portals here on Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix to continue speculating on these ancient myths and tales as to the truth in our ancient past. And I think we're making a little bit of headway. Maybe? Thoughts?
With?
Just speculating to the hidden past and ancient myth. I think we're getting there. Here on Inquad.
I mean,
we're
60
starting,
episodes. I think we're
starting to carve we've just started to scratch the surface, basically. All right, so high places, cosmic portals, possibly. So this is my wild theory, and this is gonna get this is like the History Channel after midnight. It's like, I'm not saying it was aliens, but aliens. This is the kind of vibes I've got at this point. So my wild theory. I'm just going to kind of walk you guys and gals and all you listeners out there through my process here as what I was thinking and how I kind of started connecting these dots. And I think that'll be the best way to introduce this. So I was thinking about like, okay, we have all these archetypes, right? We have Enlil, we have Baal, we have Zeus, we have Thor. For like sea deities, we have Enki, we have Yam, who is the from the Ugarit Baal Canaanite culture. He is the god of the sea. Then we also have that with Poseidon. We have a goddess of death, Ereshkigal. We have Hades in Greek mythology. We have all of these archetypes that seem to mirror each other. And so you've got to ask, is it just common themes that people struggle with, or is there something more to this? And, here at MQuad, where we believe the spiritual existence is the fourth dimension, I like to come at it from that there's something more to this. So I think that they might all be connected somehow. But then you've got to ask, okay, how would that work if they're all connected? So I started noticing a trend as I'm doing research, because I'm also researching Ugaritic poetry right now, which is that Canaanite mythology. The high places are seen as crucial. We see this coming up everywhere. And I started to theorizing, okay, it seems like these might even be meeting points of the divine council, like convergence points almost. So what if they're all connected? What if mountains are the access points for the divine council, portals through the fourth dimension? Because everywhere we look, gods live on mountains in mythology, whether it's an artificial mountain or a real mountain. We have Olympus for Greek mythology. We have the Watchers descend on Mount Hermon. We have Mount Carmel, where Elijah has a showdown with the prophets of Baal. We have the Mountain of Zion for the biblical belief system. We have Sinai for Moses getting the tablets. We have Zaphon for the Ugaritic Baal cycle. And then Enlil has Ekur. So what exactly is Ekur? Because we've talked about this one. Ekur is temple of the mountain or house of the mountain, because E for house. The Mesopotamians saw temples and houses weird, where they could kind of be interchangeable. That like a temple wasn't just seen as, a place where you go to worship. It was, no, this is a place where the god literally lived. So that's important to note here. So we have the Ekur, which is the house or temple of the mountain. But then Mesopotamia is flat. Gods need high places for this theory to hold. And that's what's interesting, is that, we have temple of the mountain or house of the mountain. The Mesopotamians built a mountain because they didn't have one where they resided. They just made ziggurats instead. And that's why we see ziggurats, I think. It directly parallels, Mount Olympus, Zion, Hermon, Zaphon, Sinai, Carmel. It ties perfectly into Babel as well. Mountain to reach the heavens. Babel in Genesis is an attempt of mankind to reach that divine council, to assert itself into the spiritual. And you see this concept mirrored later on with things like the ziggurats. What I thought was really wild, because I got this word stuck in my head from my Sumerian studies. It was Enki, which is another name for the Ekur. And I'm not sure if this is actually a second ziggurat at the site, or if it's just the same as the Ekur. I'm seeing some conflicting sources on that between what John Hayes and Jeremy Black says. But Enki, you break the word down, E, house, dur, umbilical cord, on, heaven, ki, earth. So poetically, this could be understood to be said as the house or residing place of the umbilical cord between heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. Which is pretty wild, because you literally have these ancients admitting right here in the very name in Sumerian that this very well might have been understood as a form of portal between heaven and earth, a meeting place of the mortals and the immortals. And that one really blew my mind as I was like researching it, because I was like flipping through and I saw that and I'm like, wait a second. Duranki itself was a name for another section. It was referred to as like the religious quarter. And again, it has that umbilical cord, heaven, earth, where heaven and earth unite, meaning to it. And then further on, later on in my studies, I also came across something that said both Sumerian and Akkadians have a phrase that they would say very frequently: I made the temple as high as a mountain. They're literally spelling out in their language, in these myths and in their phraseology, that these ziggurats and these mountains had divine significance to connect with the supernatural. And I started to go into the Twilight Zone, because as I was making all of these connections, I looked back at the MQuad page just to kind of refresh and see what was new on YouTube. And I realized our welcome start here video, I randomly made this piece of art through ChatGPT, And I wrote the prompt, like it wasn't just a ChatGPT idea. It was like my idea, and then I had ChatGPT do it. And it's a mountain with a pyramid in front of it, a UFO on the side, and a portal with storms around it at the top. And you yourself can go check this on the MQuad page, like right now on YouTube. This is 6 months before we're recording this podcast episode. And that's when I started to freak out a little bit, where I'm like, I literally accidentally foreshadowed this concept, this idea, this discovery in MQuad page art. And I'm like, okay, this is where it's getting a little bit trippy here.
You're just that good.
My subconscious is on it. My conscious takes about 6 months to catch up.
Pretty good buffer time.
But yeah, and so then I'm looking at this and I'm like, well, this has to be the key to the pyramids, right? Because Mesopotamian ziggurats was about connecting with the divine. The Egyptian pyramids, they're astronomically aligned to, I think, the stars of Orion. They're aligned with incredible precision to the earth. All of this detail, all of this effort, it's, again, I feel like, to connect with that same purpose, to build a mountain, where the city is, where you reside, where you live, so you can get that divine presence down. And so this is a shout out to the Snake Bros there from Brothers of the Serpent. Like, I think I just uncovered the secret of the pyramids there for you. So let me know if this one was, if Kyle or Russ, you guys ever listened to this, let me know if that one was on your pyramid bingo card for 2025. A couple other details I'll mention too, like things like copper versus iron in like modern day. Fairies and demons, watchers, I have a theory that they prefer certain types of materials, because you see fairies in a lot of mythology accounts have this repulsion to iron at the very least, but not so much to tools like copper. And you see this huge emphasis on like ziggurats and these high places being built with natural rough materials and not with tools of like iron, and not made like with iron brackets or anything like that. And so it does seem like that there is a preference for the supernatural to have more natural materials. And so you do have to ask and wonder, is that why we don't see as much spiritual stuff nowadays? Is because those elements actually limit our interaction with that aspect of the fourth dimension. And for those that are questioning if the ancients were advanced or not, because I know that there are some that are speculative about that, you can look up these two tablets and tell me if you still hold to that theory. IM 67118 and SI 427. These are both clear uses of applied geometry in ancient Mesopotamia written in Old Babylonian, so Old Akkadian. And they're not identical to things like the Pythagorean theorem, but they're very closely related to it. It's the Mesopotamians' own version of trigonometry. So specifically, IM 67118 uses, it's like the area of a rectangle and then the diagonal from one corner to another, the length of the diagonal, and then they solve for the length and width of the rectangle from that, which is, it's not exactly the Pythagorean theorem, but it's like, it's a variant of it. It's another way to do it, more or less. So they had very clear mathematical knowledge between that and then SI 427, which used scaled triangles. So like ratioed triangles, so how you have like a 3-4-5 triangle. I think I'm shooting off the hip here on this one a little bit. A 3-4-5, has the same angles as a 6-8-10 triangle, because it's just a factor of 2 multiplied. So they're using scaled triangles to deal with allocations of land and to solve that. And this is a trigonometry concept that we see the ancients using. And then, of course, we have the much later Neola pin, where they were charting and discussing the movement of the stars with high accuracy. So the big question, if the divine council presided over humanity for thousands of years, dating back to ancient Sumer, where did they go? Any thoughts?
I don't know.
I don't know either, but that's a question for the listeners to answer. I think I've proposed enough. I'm sure Stephen will send me some very in-depth thoughts, because he's a big fan of the Book of Enoch. So, Cordell, I also expect your thoughts.
We expect 1,000-word essay.
Yes, by the end of next week. That's when this episode releases, actually. Never mind. All right. Last plug I'll put in here, and then we're going to take a pause and do some closeouts. Be sure to join the Discord. We got a Discord server going. Get plugged into the community. Discuss your theories with us. We want to hear from you, and we do regularly interact with listener insights on the show. Stephen can very much tell you that firsthand. You can just go back and listen to the episodes. You hear us discussing things Stevens has said and insights that he shared. But yeah, this is not just me doing everything. This is me putting out thoughts and wanting to interact with seekers of truth. So stay tuned. We'll do conclusion, wrap up, final housekeeping items, and then close out for the evening. It's a lot to digest, I'm aware. That's what we're here for on Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix, is to overload your brain's capacity and then recap it all at the end to make it digestible and feasible. You ready for the recap?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay.
What?
I don't know. You hesitated, so
I'm just sitting here.
I was just asking you that to feel the conversation so I could write down timestamps. So I don't have to go.
I'm literally just here for support, emotional support.
Yeah.
This episode.
Well, I appreciate it. It's helping. My emotions are supported. All right. So, conclusion, to wrap up, what all have we talked about this episode? We started off with Enki. We recounted one of the accounts where he's bringing order to creation, partially through a sexual act, where he is creating abundance and creating a spring of life, the Tigris River, to help the ancient Mesopotamians. And we discussed who he is, breakdown of his name as Enki, Lord of the Earth, how he's the ruler of the underworld, underwater. Let me try that one again. The subterranean waters of the world, and God of wisdom and magic, and how that affects his status. We talked about Enlil, who is the storm deity, possibly a divine agent or angel that's gone rogue, and talked about the breakdown of his name, and Enlil, god of the winds, god of the storms, prince of the power of the air, potentially relating to Ephesians 2:2, and the connections to Lilith and Lilitu, Lilu, what that might mean, sharing the same root. We also talked about some myths involving Enlil, with Enlil and Enlil, and the account of non-consensual encounter that happened there, and some of the psychology behind that. And then we also explored An, who is this shadowy king. He's almost a Yahweh type figure that we see in the background, and what that might mean when we start seeing these overlapping archetypes listed throughout not just Mesopotamian literature, but throughout different regions as well. And then after talking about the sun and moon deities and how that might relate to the Watchers and Enoch, we talked about ziggurats, Herman, and all sorts of other high places, and how they might actually just be spiritual access points. But yeah, I think that the divine council theory explains the similarities that we see across the pantheons. That this makes sense as to why all of these ancients had the same archetypes for their gods, is because they encountered the same type of beings, and they just attributed slightly different aspects to them, but the broad theme was the same. Because all of the listeners know how much I am against this myth copied, that myth theory. I think it's incredibly disrespectful, I think, to these myths to argue things that all of these myths evolved from an original source, and that that it's just copies of copies of copies. I think that there's a lot more to it than that, and there's more logic and reason to argue it that way, especially looking from that Proto-Semitic heritage where these myths are just then disseminated and just remembered differently as different languages evolve. But yeah, my goal now is to go hike Olympus, because if if these were divine convergence points, there would be evidence of some sort. I don't know what, but I would theorize there'd be some type of evidence that something lived or interacted or traveled. I don't know how to quantify all of this, and this is where the listeners can help out. But I'd go do it right now if I knew Greek well enough and I had enough money. But yeah, I have neither of those things. I have a rudimentary knowledge of Greek, and so definitely help us flesh out some ideas here on what we could look for if we go to Olympus, because I definitely want to go. I want to backpack for like maybe a week, 2, 3 weeks in Olympus. And I have, I've done like a week of backpacking in the Smokies and Natahalas too, so it's not exactly something foreign to me. I did recently participated in the Norwegian foot march competition, where you get a nice certificate. You ruck 18.6 miles, and you have to do it in 4.5 hours for my age group, and I did it in 4 hours and 25 minutes before I made it about halfway, and then my feet started seizing up, so that was fun. Like I was hobbling. I couldn't run anymore, but you don't have to run in Olympus unless you have a Nephilim chasing you. So, all right, let's do final random housekeeping items, and then we will do closeouts. All right. One thing I noticed when I'm going through the Nulla pin is that Ninurta seemed connected to Mercury, which I thought was interesting in relation to my Nibiru theory about Enki being connected to Mercury, which it seems like he is in some instances, but not in others. I'm not going to re-break down that whole theory. We've already given you a lot to digest. I did that one on the Enuma Elish episode, which I believe is episode 35. You can go listen to that and rehash it. But the long story short is it seems like the more I dig into this, the more nuanced it gets as to how the ancients might have quantified these things. But it's a factor worth considering. And so I want to put that out there, that might be a small ding on my initial research on what Nibiru actually is. That being said, I have not yet found any evidence of Nibiru in the ancient texts other than its appearance in the Enuma Elish, which is a pretty late text, nor one place in the Nulla Pin, because I have the transliteration side by side. I haven't seen, it mentions the Star of Marduk, but that's not necessarily Nibiru, depending on how you want to take the meaning of that. So I'm going to keep doing research. I want to, if anyone has some like concrete Sitchin like sources, I'm learning Sumerian, I'm learning Akkadian. I am open to the ancient astronaut theory. I just see zero evidence for it. So if you have actual concrete evidence, research, translation notes that Sitchin posted somewhere that I've just not found, send them to me at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. I will 100% take a look and do an episode breaking down if it's good or bad or somewhere in between. So, but yeah, I don't see a lot to support the Nibiru theory from this point in my research. Also, there will be an MQuad dictionary. It's already up right now, actually, on the mquadmusings.com website that we do have up now. It's to help people keep track of terms. So, like, I know I threw out a lot of Sumerian words like Ekur, Derenki, Edorenki, Nippur, Eridu, all of these things, all these places. If you need a quick reference for definitions, mquadmusings.com, no periods, because I can't do pyramids. Periods in I can't do pyramids either in a URL domain, but I can't do periods other than .com. So mquadmusings.com. By the time you hear this episode, it will have been out for like probably a week and a half or so. So I'll have added a good bit to it, hopefully. But yeah, that's all I have. Do you have any other concluding thoughts for the audience?
Stay curious. Stay curious.
Seek truth. Don't fall into confirmation bias. So many people on my page with confirmation bias, and it's, yeah. And then they think they don't, and they think everyone else does, and it's just, it's painful. But yeah, all right. Buy us a cup of coffee. Link's going to be in the show notes. It does take a lot of time, effort, research to uncover things like this. I put in, as you can tell, a ton of effort. I'm going through and learning ancient languages and studying ancient languages to further my knowledge, expertise, and understanding here. So if you're able to support the show at all, it is greatly appreciated. $25 donation or more will get you mentioned as a producer for the upcoming show. So yeah, if you want to be noted for your contributions. And if you're not able to... why can I not talk at the end of the show? I don't know why.
Because you've been talking for a while.
Yeah, I've been talking for over an hour. But yes, at the very least, if you can't support the show financially, totally get it, totally understand. There's always zero pressure there. At the very least, though, we would ask that you consider sharing the podcast with someone if you know someone that's interested in this type of content. Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, m.quad.musings. Facebook is Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. As always, email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. As the Sharatum here said, we want friends.
Yes.
Send us your confessions,
Be a
concessions,
friend.
contentions, whatever you like about the show, whatever you don't like about the show. You can also comment that as well if you're listening on YouTube. Discord server link is in the show notes. There's a new channel there as well where I share these types of discoveries as I make them. So if you want to watch the M-Quad research take shape as it actually happens, more or less in real time, you definitely want to be there. Last thing I'll say is whether you've been listening on the earth with the mortals, in the stars of heaven with Enoch and the cherubim, or
Down in Sheol.
we thank you for quantumly transcending time to join us for this epic mythology and fourth dimensional discovery, and hope you have a good rest of your night.